Somewhere above Albuquerque, New Mexico, concrete blast doors sit flush inside a granite mountain. You can find them on satellite maps right now. Portals cut deep into living rock, access roads leading nowhere a civilian was ever supposed to go. For 40 years, those tunnels held what may have been the largest concentration of nuclear weapons in American history. Then the Cold War ended, the mission contracted, and America walked away. The doors are still there. The mountain looks exactly as it always has. And most of the city living in its shadow still doesn't know what was stored inside. The mountain had a name before it had a secret. The Manzano Mountains, Manzano meaning apple in Spanish, named for the orchards that once grew at their base, rise along the eastern edge of Albuquerque, brown and granite and unremarkable from any road. They look like every other ridge in central New Mexico. That was the point. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device in the Kazakhstan steppe. The explosion lasted a fraction of a second. The consequences lasted 4 decades. Until that morning, the United States had been the only country on Earth with nuclear weapons. After it, American military planners faced a problem no one had seriously planned for. Where do you hide the arsenal when the enemy can now destroy it? The answer was granite. The Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense needed a storage site that could physically survive a Soviet nuclear strike, not a warehouse, not a bunker under a flat field, but something the Earth itself would shield. They needed it adjacent to Sandia National Laboratories, which was already engineering America's nuclear weapons on the grounds of Kirtland Air Force Base at Albuquerque's southern edge. They needed proximity to aircraft that could retrieve and deliver what was stored, and they needed something that would look, from the road and from the air, like nothing at all. The Manzano Mountains were right there. Construction of what the government designated Site Able began in 1949, moving almost simultaneously with the Soviet test that had triggered the need. Workers blasted tunnels into the granite face and lined them with concrete. They cut access roads into the slope. They shaped earthwork berms to redirect blast overpressure. The finished facility, later formally named the Kirtland Underground Munitions Storage Complex, or KUMSC, spread across approximately 2,880 acres on Kirtland's eastern edge. The Sandia engineers who designed the weapons could see the storage mountain from their laboratory buildings. The weapons were engineered on one side of a perimeter fence, transported across, and locked inside the rock. The entire design-to-storage pipeline ran within the boundaries of a single base. No other location in the American nuclear system compressed so much purpose into so little distance. Albuquerque, filling in fast with post-war housing and veterans' families, had no public accounting for any of it. Workers who entered those tunnel portals each morning were security cleared and sworn. The facility appeared on no public map in any useful form. For families across the city's South Valley and the Heights neighborhoods, the knowledge stopped at the gate. A spouse or parent worked at Kirtland on something they could not discuss. That was the implicit arrangement. The government provided clearances, paychecks, and mission. The workers provided labor and silence. And Albuquerque grew around it, new subdivisions and shopping strips spreading toward the base perimeter, while new families moved in with no idea what was stored in the range above them. The secrecy was not particular cruelty. It was the institutional reflex of an entire era. The mountain kept its silence because the people inside it kept theirs. That held until April 11, 1950. A B-29 superfortress out of Kirtland climbed east toward the Manzano Range that morning on a training mission. The aircraft carried a nuclear-configured weapon, the fissile core removed per standard protocol, but the conventional high explosives that surrounded it fully in place. Somewhere over the eastern slope, the aircraft lost altitude and struck the mountain. All 13 crew members were killed. The conventional explosives detonated on impact, sending smoke up from a ridgeline that hours earlier had been receiving weapons for storage in the tunnels below. People in Albuquerque could see it from their front yards. The crash was classified. What official acknowledgement came was stripped of context. Residents learned nothing about the nuclear configuration of the aircraft. They learned nothing about the weapons in the mountain the plane had struck. No warning was issued, no evacuation ordered, no explanation given for the fire on the slope. Local press reported what the military would confirm, which was very little. The mountain went on standing. 13 men were dead on a slope the city wasn't supposed to know contained anything. The work inside the tunnels continued the next morning. Through the 1950s, the tunnels filled. Accounts from personnel who worked inside the Manzano complex documented in Inside Manzano, the only book-length history of the facility drawn from first-hand accounts, describe a working environment that looked, in many ways, like a warehouse. Concrete-lined corridors, climate-controlled storage areas, inventory systems, inspection schedules, maintenance rotations. The weapons arrived, were cataloged, were checked, were stored. The routines were disciplined and quiet. What made the place unlike any warehouse on Earth was what was being counted. By some estimates, the tunnels eventually held hundreds of nuclear weapons components, and by the height of the Cold War, accounts suggest the figure may have reached well over 1,000. The exact inventory has never been publicly released. The classification that protected the mission in 1949 still protects those numbers today. What is not classified is what it took to run the place. Workers drove in from Albuquerque every morning, not from remote base housing on an isolated installation, but from real neighborhoods. South Valley streets, the Heights, ordinary Albuquerque. They passed through Kirtland's gates before sunrise, descended into the operational rhythm of the mountain, and drove home in the evening to grocery runs, little league games, church suppers, neighborhood gossip. They could not say where they had been, not in any useful sense. A spouse might know the general answer, Kirtland, the secure area, something classified, and understand that the specifics were off the table. Children grew up knowing their parent worked somewhere important and could not explain it. The secrecy was not theater. It was a condition of employment that followed these workers into every dinner conversation they could not have. A city of ordinary life, built beside the world's most powerful nuclear cache, connected to it by a paycheck and a silence. Sandia National Laboratories sat at the center of this ecosystem. The laboratory had grown out of the wartime Z Division of Los Alamos, relocated to Kirtland in 1949, specifically to be close to the delivery aircraft, and now to the mountain storage complex. The engineers who solved the engineering problems of nuclear weapons, the arming systems, the fusing, the safety mechanisms, worked in buildings where, on a clear day, they could see the slope that held what they had built. The design pipeline and the storage vault were separated by a security fence and a short drive. The weapons moved from a drawing board to test bed to storage tunnel without ever leaving the base perimeter. This was deliberate, rational, and extraordinarily concentrated. It was also, as the 1950 crash had already demonstrated, a system dense with risk. In May 1957, a B-36 Peacemaker on approach to Kirtland accidentally released a nuclear weapon at altitude. The weapon fell approximately 1,700 feet before striking the ground near one of the base's storage structures. The conventional explosives in the weapon detonated. There was no nuclear yield, but the impact area was contaminated with weapons-grade uranium, and the cleanup that followed was conducted under classification. A second broken arrow, the military's designation for a nuclear weapons accident, at the same base within 7 years of the first. The mountain held the weapons, the aircraft carried them, and the accidents stayed quiet. Meanwhile, Albuquerque kept growing. By the late 1950s, the base and the labs together were among the largest employers in New Mexico. Kirtland's economic footprint spread through the city in the way military payrolls do, not just workers, but contractors, suppliers, restaurants, real estate, retail. Families at the base commissary on a Friday afternoon, kids running between parked cars, officers buying produce in uniform, the kind of domestic scene that could have played out at any large American installation, entirely unremarkable except for the mountain in the eastern background. The community that had formed around this mission did not know its full shape. It knew the gate, the paycheck, and the policy of not asking. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought 13 days during which the tunnels and the aircraft parked on Kirtland's flight line represented one of the most concentrated nuclear-ready positions in the United States. Across town, people watched television news about Soviet ships and American destroyers and missile sites in Cuba. At Kirtland, alert status elevated. The weapons in the mountain had never been more relevant. The mission had never felt more permanent. That sense of permanence was the most dangerous thing the facility ever produced. No treaty appeared to threaten the arrangement. No budget crisis was visible from inside the gate. The granite was solid, the tunnels functional, the Sandia pipeline producing. Somewhere in the logic of those years, the people who worked inside the mountain and the city built up around its base arrived at the same quiet conclusion. This is what this place will always be. The mountain stood over that assumption and said nothing. The Soviet Union that had made the mountain necessary dissolved on December 25, 1991. The START I Treaty, signed earlier that year, committed both superpowers to deep reductions in their nuclear arsenals. For military planners, the arithmetic of consolidation followed quickly. Fewer warheads meant fewer storage sites, and fewer storage sites meant someone had to decide which facilities were redundant. A hollowed mountain in New Mexico, expensive to staff and maintain, adjacent to a city that had grown large enough to create its own complications, did not survive that calculation. The mission at KUMSC contracted through the 1990s. Pantex Plant, a flat above-ground weapons assembly and storage facility outside Amarillo, Texas, absorbed much of what the mountain had held. The most dramatic Cold War storage concept, carve the vault from the living rock and make the earth itself the shield, was replaced by cheaper, more accessible infrastructure on the Texas Panhandle. The workers who had driven in from Albuquerque before sunrise stopped driving in. The inventory that had filled those concrete-lined corridors was moved or dismantled. The tunnels did not collapse. The access roads did not wash away. The blast doors, set flush into the granite face, remained exactly where the construction crews had placed them in 1949. The mountain did not change. That was the first strange fact of the afterlife. No crater, no demolition, no visible evidence of ending. The Manzano Mountains looked identical on the morning after consolidation as they had on the morning before. The physical infrastructure of the most important nuclear storage complex in American history did not require removal. It only required emptying. And emptying left no mark a person standing on the valley floor could see. What the valley floor could not see was already moving underground. The fuel contamination at Kirtland Air Force Base had begun accumulating long before the weapons mission contracted. Jet fuel, primarily JP-8, leaking from storage systems over years and decades and pooling in the soil beneath the base. By the time the New Mexico Environment Department began pressing the Air Force for accountability, estimates of the spill volume had reached approximately 24 million gallons, making it one of the largest known underground fuel releases at any American military installation. The plume was invisible from the surface. It migrated through the vadose zone, the unsaturated soil above the water table, moving slowly and steadily toward the aquifer that supplies the majority of Albuquerque's drinking water, the same city the base had been built to defend. The Air Force and the New Mexico Environment Department spent years in dispute over cleanup timelines. State regulators pushed for faster action. The base's institutional culture, trained across 4 decades to manage problems internally and disclose selectively, did not adapt quickly to external environmental accountability. The contamination that had accumulated in silence, in the same way the accidents of 1950 and 1957 had been managed in silence, now had to be explained in public. To regulators, to water utility officials, to a city that had never been given the full accounting of what had been operating in the mountain above its eastern skyline. The irony is almost too clean to state plainly. The base built to protect Albuquerque from nuclear annihilation had spent decades quietly threatening Albuquerque's water supply. The secrecy that had shielded the weapons mission had also shielded the contamination. The same reflex that had kept 13 dead men on a classified slope in 1950 from reaching the front page of the Albuquerque Journal had kept the fuel plume out of public view until the numbers became impossible to minimize. The mountain kept its silence. The ground beneath the base did not. Today, monitoring wells dot the base perimeter, extracting contaminated soil vapor and tracking the plume's migration. The remediation is active, ongoing, and unresolved. Albuquerque's water utility monitors its aquifer. The cleanup infrastructure is invisible from the road. Pipes in the ground, gauges on wells, trucks arriving periodically with no visible drama, which means the environmental consequence of Kirtland's operational decades is managed in the same register in which it was created, quietly, below the surface, out of public sight. The Manzano Mountain Wilderness, managed by the Cibola National Forest, shares a boundary fence with the facility. Hikers buy permits, park at trailheads, and walk into terrain that brushes against the perimeter of what was once the most heavily armed piece of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. The Forest Service signs describe the wilderness, elevation, trail conditions, wildlife. There is no interpretive panel explaining the concrete portals visible in the rock face from certain angles. No historical marker. No museum. The only thorough public documentation of what the facility looked like from above comes from open-source satellite imagery and aerial photographs posted on sites outside any official channel. The most secret nuclear installation in American history is now more accessible on a phone screen than it ever was in the local newspaper during the 40 years it was operational. Pull up the satellite view, find the eastern edge of Kirtland Air Force Base, trace the access roads up the slope toward the Manzano Range. The tunnel portals are still there, set into the granite exactly as they were placed in 1949, the year the Soviets tested their first bomb, and America decided to put its arsenal inside a mountain. The mountain is unchanged. The doors are sealed. The city below them still does not know exactly what was stored there, or how much of the damage is still moving through the ground beneath it.